Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of Peter and Wendy. Today I have started it early, so I am thinking of doing it every Sunday, 1:30 p.m. So let's start with as we have already read about the summary, we will start with the other part. So in part 2, we will discuss about what about the writer and everything. So yeah. So as we read the summary, we know what was the main highlight of the story. Now I will tell you about its section and structure and style which they did. Peter and Wendy is a classic children's fantasy adventure story which Barrie adapted from his 1904 play. The novel can also be classified as a coming of age tale, as Barrie text follows Wendy's darling from her infancy through old age, as well kind of allegory for adult readers about the dangers of over romanticizing childhood. Peter and Wendy is narrated more or less chronographically in a mixture of a third person omniscient voice and first person. Description of characters and places are detailed, but the objectivity of this description varies because of the narrator. It's highly opinionated and subject in the view of events individuals. Indeed, the narrator disclaims any true ownership of the plot by asserting that his account is second or third hand information and by making it clear that he's picking selected stories and details to share about with the reader and omitting others. The narrator also explicitly speaks to different types of readers, darting rapidly, especially between some observation aimed at children and other targeted towards adults. The novel overall tone is light-hearted and satirical, but at times the tone becomes darker and more mockingly, particularly when dealing with Wendy and Mrs. Darling. The first section of the novel focuses on Wendy's life before meeting Peter Pan. The second part details her and her brother's time in Neverland with Peter and the Lost Boys, and their conflicts with the bloodthirsty Captain Hook. The final part of the novel deals with children's return from Neverland events which transpire after Wendy grew up. The romanticization of childhood of paramount concern is Peter and Wendy. The novel acknowledges the attraction of children's present focus, joy, imagination, and innocence, but also underscores that the same attributes make children selfish, cruel, and otherwise incapable of sustaining in-depth care for understanding of others. Though all the children, Wendy, Michael, John, and the Lost Boys, embody childhood's good and bad qualities, Peter Pan exemplifies those poor qualities, demonstrating what children's apparent heartless looks like. Taken to its full logical conclusion, Peter and Wendy imbues motherhood with a kind of magic, one which has simultaneously supports and offers a counterbalance of the magic of childhood. Ultimately, the novel indicates it is the mothers who encourage children to grow up, thus to become capable of mature love. In this sense, mothers thought attractive to Peter Pan, and all he represents are all his chief antagonists. The narrative presents both Mrs. Darling and Wendy as part women and part child. Unlike Wendy brothers or the Lost Boy who appear either wholly childish or wholly adult, this duality gives the female power. Wendy alone is able to embrace both reality and imagination without confusing the two. And both Wendy and Mrs. Darling remember Peter and tell stories about him even after growing up themselves. But it also appears to a good narrator who alternately admires and insults the character's ability to find happiness in growing up. While the novel appears to draw a line of separation between the real world and Neverland, in fact, elements of both fantastical and the everyday appear in both realms. Captain Hook is a graduate of English boarding school Eton College, and Tinkerbell meant spots. The darling nurse is a dog who acts like a human, and Mrs. Darling recognizes her children's thoughts while they sleep. The novel's frank treatment of death reflects the era of composition, a time when young angels died with fair regularity. Even in Netherlands, death is present. Lost boys sometimes perish battling pirates or Indians or by Peter's own hand if they grow too old. The first chapter of the book indicates that one of Peter Pan's job is guiding dead children to afterlife. While death is naturally a melancholy idea, Barry reminds the reader that children's limited conception of death means they don't fear it the way adults do. Rather, they just see another kind of adventure. Captain Cook and Mr. Darling serve as both double roles one another. However, unlike Cook, who remained concerned only with his own ego and the abstractical idea of good form until his death, Mr. Darling learns to care less about society's expectation and truly love something outside himself when his children disappear into Neverland. The tickling crocodile symbolizes both Captain Hook's fear of the passage of time and he believes in the incapacity of fate. This symbolizes, however, exists almost solely in Hook's mind. Though crocodile hunts and ultimately kills Hook, it isn't it's because of its fate, but because of Peter Pan's action. If you look deeply in the historical thing, during much of the Queen Victoria reign, adults primarily viewed children as small version of themselves, born sinful and expected to contribute to the household. In 1819, the scores of children still toiled away up to 12 hours a day in factories and mines and as domestic help. As the 19th century grew close, however, Britain's upper and middle class together with its artists and authors began to reconsider the meaning of childhood and started to push for child labor and education reforms. Adults also began to entertain the notion of childhood innocence and to draw a line between freedom of childhood and the responsibilities of adulthood. Novelists like Catherine Sinclair contribute to the shifting view of the deceptions of middle class nursery life, understanding the idea of childhood and something sacred. Increasingly, women of this period also found themselves encouraged to operate solely within the domestic sphere and to embody the same innocence and dependence upon their husband and father as would children. But adult interest in reinventing childhood during the Edwardian era wasn't limited to social reform. Indeed, such was adult fascination with children performed their innocence that poet Ernest Dawson dubbed it the cult of the children. As adult focuses on childhood, these cult adherents argued served as an antidote to the degeneracy of modern life. Even as idealization of childhood flourished, however, the theory that the child's core nature equated in some manner this kind of savagery also gained legitimacy as the late Victorian psychologist Havelock Hills argued children are never to be the animal to the savage, to the criminal than the adult. The charm of childhood lies in frank egoism and reckless obedience to impulse. Authors like Barrie and Lewis Carroll delved into extreme contradiction in their work, creating engaging escapes from the child troubles of adulthood, which simultaneously demonstrated and demythologized the youthful human mind. In another way, some Edwardian children's literature anticipated by most fully century the modern neuroscientific understanding of consciousness and memory and of children's emotion and moral development. The genesis of the story that would form the basis of Peter and Wendy emerged most directly from Barrie's demise to amuse George, John, Peter, and later Michael and Nicholas Llewellyn Davis, from whom he met in London's Kingston Garden, but arguably key elements of the Peter Man narrative developed far earlier. When Barrie's older brother David died in a skating accident, his mother's subsequent depression and emotional withdrawal taught her surviving son that idea someone can be more important than what is right in front of us. The incident provided both the kernel of the idea of the boy who would never grow up and form foundation for Barrie's powerful but often contradictory feeling about mothers and motherhood versus his interest in the interplay between the real and the imaginary. Later in life, Barrie would repeatedly claim his story about Peter Pan weren't entirely his own, but came from a result of an inner dialogue with a fictional channel called, also named David. Barrie once said that first I tell it to him, and then he tells it to me. The understanding began, and that it's a quite different story. Then I retell it with additions, and so we go on till no one could say whether it's more the story or mine. The first mention of Peter Pan in print was with the novel aimed at adults, The Little White Bird. In the novel, Barrie, taking his inspiration from the youngest Llewellyn Davis boy Peter, figures Peter Pan as a bird like an infant. Barrie later republished the chapters of The Little Bird, which featured Peter Pan as an illustrated book. Peter Pan in Kingston's Garden, another version of the character, appeared in Barrie's Phantom style Peter Pan or The Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up, which premiered in 1904 to great acclaim. The play introduced the character of Captain Hook, a variation of the Captain Swarthy character Barrie had created while playing with the Llewellyn Davis voice. The captain has inspired by Robert Louis Stevenson's infamous pirate in Treasure Island. Long John Silver, interestingly, the Barrie's choice to include Hook in the play came less than the belief that Peter Pan named an antagonist. Indeed, Barrie's notes reveal that he believed Peter himself was the only villain the play required, then from the necessity of making enough time for set and costume changes. Barrie also originally envisioned Mrs. Darling and Hook being played by the same actor, though ultimately it was Mr. Darling who became the pirate's Captain Double. The character Wendy also appeared the first time in the play, scenes based in part upon Barrie's mother, Margaret Ogilvy, whose own mother died young, requiring her to become a mother figure to her brothers, which still a child herself, and in part upon the daughter of Barrie's friend William Henley. Before her death at age 6, Margaret Henley, all called Barrie her friendly, her infantile pronunciation, however, rendered the word as Wendy. Barrie adapted his play into his novel Peter and Wendy in 1911. Peter and Wendy widespread critical acclaim upon its publication in 1911. The New York Times praised Barrie's ability to make reader quiet to see it all and feel all the fear and joy of combat and quite wonderful adventure. Meanwhile, the London magazine The Spectator noted the novel was readily enjoyable for children and adults. Modern cities continue to find the novel noteworthy and are practically fascinated by Barrie's seemingly intricate gaps of child psychology and cognitive development. The novel's connection in the field of psychology was strengthened in 1983 when American psychologist Stan Kenley formulated the term Peter Pan syndrome to describe grown men who act like young boys than adults. Later, he also coined the Wendy dilemma as a means of discussing the problem of women who act more like mothers than wives in their marriages. And popular entertainment character stories of Peter Pan have fostered a huge body of creative works. Walt Disney famously adapted the book into animated film in 1953, one which offered a much more straightforward narrative but all eliminated the novel's darker themes. I have seen that movie, Peter Pan, animated one, Peter Pan, in which it was first done by Wendy. And then the part 2, it was upon her daughter, Jane. They made actually a sequel to this. Then, yeah, but as usually Walt Disney eliminates the darker themes. In 1954, Peter Pan Broadway musical starring MaryMartin was immensely successful and has enjoyed many relatives over the years. Steven Spielberg created a sequel to Peter Pan in which his movie Hook in 1911. I've also seen that movie in my childhood with my parents in the Hook. And I thought it was a Disney movie and I was searching in Disney Hotstar, but I didn't find it. But yeah, I've seen the movie. It had Robin Williams and Julia Roberts. And it's quite worth watching. They have created that sequel very fantastically. And in that, I won't spoil it. You should watch that movie, Hook. And J.M.Barrie and Diley Person wrote series of prequel novels from 2004 to 2009, which later adapted into the Tony Award-winning Peter Pan and Stretcher. More recently, from 2011 to 2008 television, Once Upon a Time focused on showcasing Peter Pan's dark side and the depiction of the character. Well, if you want to know more about the author J.M.Barrie, I will suggest you to see the movie Finding Neverland starring Johnny Depp and Kate Winslet. I have watched the movie and it very beautifully tells about J.M.Barrie's actual life. So I had got a little bit hint from that only why he named the Peter Pan character, and it's a good movie. You can watch it. So thank you for listening, and yeah, if you like it, please subscribe. And if you want to know more about other stories or more summaries or novel magna, anything, you can just comment it down, ping, and yeah, subscribe our channel. Thank you. See you next week on Sunday, and timing will be checked. It is 1:30 p.m. Okay, bye bye.